An uptick in extreme weather will significantly reshape the U.S. housing market over the next few decades. By 2055, nearly $1.5 trillion in property value will be lost across the U.S. as a result of growing climate risks, according to a new study from First Street. With more on which regions will be most impacted and how, we're joined by Jeremy Porter, who's the First Street head of climate implications research. Just take us into that headline figure and some of the regions that you're anticipating this will kind of be most felt across.
Yeah, it was a really interesting research report from our perspective, in the sense that we've really been focused on direct damages to properties in our past research around climate risk. So what happens if there's 3 feet against a building footprint? How much damage does that cost? But recently we've been focused a lot on more of what we call the indirect impacts. What happens if the community is impacted and all of a sudden population changes, or there's chronic exposure, and we see outward migration or increases in insurance cost. And ultimately what we found was that the property value impact was as significant as the damage impacts that we were finding. In a lot of ways, more significant, because it ends up impacting the entire housing market or real estate market. And ultimately what we found was about $1.47 trillion in expected impact on the real estate market out 30 years. Places like Florida, which continue to see population growth, we're projecting to continue to see population growth out into the future, but are really being impacted by increases in insurance costs, both in the residential and the commercial space, are likely to be impacted. Louisiana, places out in the West where we've seen increases in wildfire risk. Traditionally, just these places where we're seeing more and more exposure, finally, we're starting to see that exposure make its way into the real estate market. And so
as we're seeing it make its way into the real estate market, I wonder how that is also impacting insurability.
Yeah, insurability is a big piece of it. And for about 2 to 3 decades now, we've seen increases in both the frequency and the severity of these climate disasters or weather disasters. It's really been the last 5 to 6 years that we've seen this rapid uptick in insurance cost that's responding to those payouts associated with the actual exposure to those weather disasters. So we're right at the beginnings of starting to feel the pressures in the housing market and in the real estate market, where a few years after we see increases in insurance costs, we're seeing property owners and buyers, whether they be homeowners or home buyers or commercial property buyers, start to price in that additional cost of insurance into their negotiations. And we're actually seeing property value devaluations in the market. We're expecting to see that to continue to increase, and it's going to be driven by wind in the Gulf Coast. It's going to be driven by increased flood risk across much of the country, but places like the Mid-Atlantic and places like the Midwest, where we're seeing more extreme precipitation events. And then weather that's actually more conducive to wildfires out west, like what we're seeing now in LA, is driving up the insurability in some of those spaces.
Jeremy, with all of this in mind, for first-time home buyers or those who have just been able to get into homes in these regions, it sounds like there's going to be a dramatic shift in their own ability to compound the wealth that they've kind of poured into their living situations. How much of a impact do you foresee this having on people's ability to compound their wealth as is measured through their homes?
Yeah, and we believe risk should be priced properly. So risk, insurance companies are taking the steps to price risk properly. It's not a big deal for people that have a lot of equity built up or have a mortgage they've taken out a few decades ago. I own a home. If I had a big spike in my own insurance cost, I would probably eat it and say it's just another additional cost on sort of the homeownership burden. But for people that have just taken a mortgage out in the last 5, 6, 7 years, they took one out with an expectation around a certain amount of principal, a certain amount of interest, a certain amount of taxes, and a certain amount of insurance that they would have to pay to be able to afford that home. As they've seen these rapid increases in insurance cost, they've essentially seen a spike in that mortgage cost, to the point to where even at the beginning of the century, we were seeing people pay about 10% of their mortgage in insurance costs. Today, we're seeing about 23% of the average mortgage across the country is made up of the insurance cost of the property. And people that bought their home 5 years ago, if they knew what they would be paying today for insurance, they probably would have bought a home that was potentially cheaper, with the expectation that they would have to be able to afford that increase in insurance costs. And as that makes its way into the valuation of the property, we are looking at a space in which the traditional American dream, where you build your wealth by owning a home, is starting to become not as possible in certain areas. Certainly not as lucrative as we've seen in past decades.
Some really interesting findings from the study here, and we'll see exactly how home buyers, homeowners take this into account. Jeremy, we appreciate you breaking it down with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.